Okay, Mansfield today on a Monday, and that means we start off the week with business as usual. And as usual, Chris Gibbons is our business analyst. Chris, nice to have you with us once again. Two main headlines this morning, Chris. One involves Russia, Ukraine, and America. The other, to sum it up, South Africa's economy and the state of the nation. Where are you going to go first?
Jeremy, good morning. It has to be the Ukraine story. The Americans and their allies are convinced an invasion from Russia is on the cards. Washington has said it could happen as early as this week, and they've pulled all their diplomatic personnel. They've also ordered all US citizens to leave the Ukraine. And that's been echoed by a number of their allies. As a result, markets ended last week in an even more jittery state than they have been for a while. The Dow was down 1.4% on Friday evening, the S&P 500 down 2%, the Nasdaq down nearly 3%. Similar amounts of red ink elsewhere, pretty much all the big European bourses, although not as much as New York. In Moscow, the MOEX was down 3%. The MOEX is the one that's denominated in rubles. The dollar-denominated equivalent, the RTSI, was down 5%.
Okay, but then explain to me what that's got to do with all of us. I mean, nobody wants a war, and it's a hell of a long way away from us.
Correct, and at first glance, you're right. Didn't the JSE set new closing highs, record closing highs on Wednesday? It did, no question. But I can also point out that the price of crude oil has gone from $78 a barrel at the start of the year to $95.60 or thereabouts this morning, largely on uncertainty over Ukraine. Now, you don't need me to remind you that every time we fill up, that hits us in our pockets down here in the southern tip of Africa. But also, every time that we buy anything that moves by road from a shop, we feel the impact there as well. And that's just about everything if you stop and think about it. That rising oil price is the reason why inflation is so high here and why the Reserve Bank keeps raising interest rates. Now, obviously, if war does break out, we won't feel it as directly as the residents of Kiev or Kharkiv, but we're already feeling it very much indeed right here.
Yeah, look, that oil price. I think things could have been a lot worse if it wasn't for a really resilient rand.
Bloomberg had an interesting story, Jeremy, over the weekend about just that. We've been up compared with the dollar for 5 of the last 6 weeks, which is surprising given rising US Treasury yields and the likelihood of sharper interest rate hikes in the US. Surely, against such a background, the rand, like many another emerging market currency, should start to crumble. But no, the rand is no longer following what Bloomberg calls the emerging markets playbook. Apparently, and I didn't know this, the rand is known amongst currency traders as the rattler, because of its ability to strike back hard, snap back in the opposite direction to a big move. Why does this happen? Well, anyone who tells you why currencies do what they do is probably lying. But there are a couple of theories. One is that investors are looking for yield and that those who've been long the dollar are finding themselves caught short. Second theory is that it's a commodity play, with the rand getting help from robust commodity prices. And the third theory is that foreigners have been buying South African bonds in the most sustained spell, according to Bloomberg, since last May. Which of those is right? Probably all of them, to greater or lesser extent. As I've said before, if I could call currencies correctly, we'd be having this conversation from my private island in the Caribbean.
Is the IMF, this is the crux of it maybe, is the IMF being fair to us?
Well, it's nothing, Jeremy, that we haven't heard in one form or another many times before, but it's getting louder and it's getting clearer each time. The country needs to cut its debt, sort out the state-owned enterprises, and put a lid on the public sector wage bill. Says the IMF, quoted by Business Day, the macroeconomic fundamentals have weakened. And they want Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana to use the budget to, I quote, define concrete measures including containing public sector compensation, rationalizing transfers to SOEs, streamlining tax expenditures, and better targeting education subsidies, unquote. Now, looking ahead, the IMF says it expects the economy to have grown by 4.6% in 2021, last year. We don't have that final number yet. And that follows 2020's slide of 6.4% as a result, of course, of the pandemic. But this year, it's only forecasting growth of just 1.9%, and next year, a meager 1.4%. Now, those are very weak numbers indeed, and well below the predictions from National Treasury and our own Reserve Bank. The rand certainly does reflect our economic weakness, but also quite a few other things, like the three we mentioned a moment ago. And cast your mind back to 2010, right at the beginning of the so-called Zuma years. We have a rand-dollar rate then of about 7 rand 20. So long term, that's not rand resilience. Long term, that is a disaster. Only about 30% of the JSE's listed companies are truly connected to the domestic economy. And that's also a reflection of management saying, you know what, we need our revenues in hard currencies from economies that are growing. In other words, some 70% of the JSE has emigrated. They've left the country. They didn't wait for an IMF warning. They legged it a long time ago.
Which, of course, brings us to this year's State of the Nation address. Did you hear anything that you thought could reverse the trend?
Jeremy, in short, no, I'm afraid. Just like the last half dozen of these elaborate set pieces, it was all about we're going to do this and we're going to get that sorted, and nothing ever happens. It's no coincidence, in my view, that the IMF warning was issued on the same day as the State of the Nation address. And allow me to repeat that. The IMF says the country needs to cut its debt, sort out state-owned enterprises, put a lid on the public sector wage bill. How many times has President Ramaphosa promised similar things? And his finance ministers, and even ex-President Zuma said similar things towards the end of his term. Heard to make similar promises, and again, nothing happened. The movement, as we have seen, is glacial. Now, Ramaphosa recognizes this, so we have top business executive Sipho Nkosi installed in the presidency, charged with cutting red tape. But here's the question: why is Ramaphosa unable, for example, to place a boot under the backside of his mining minister Gwede Mantashe and to unblock mining license applications? Did you know that Mantashe's department is sitting on applications for the transfer of mineral rights and the renewal of rights which date back to 2004? Imagine that, 2004. Why is Home Affairs so completely and utterly useless to get basic things like IDs and passports out? And I'm not even going to mention things like driving licenses. Yet the civil service gets fatter and fatter and fatter.
But Chris, let's be fair here. Weren't you encouraged to hear that he was going to let the private sector start looking at sorting out some of these issues?
Jeremy, the average civil servant is paid higher in South Africa than his or her private sector counterpart. What for? If they can't do the job, fire them and get someone who can. It's as simple as that. Except this new initiative with the private sector looks already stillborn to me. Why is that? Well, the ANC's allies, COSATU, and the SA Communist Party have already said they're not going to play this game. When the president says it's the private sector that creates jobs and not the state, they say he's wrong. They weren't consulted, they're having none of this. Game over.
Well, talking of game over, it certainly looks that way for South Africa's biggest oil refinery, Sapref in Durban.
Jeremy, Sapref provides about 35% of South Africa's refined product. Its joint owners Shell and BP say they're pausing production with almost immediate effect, but certainly no later than the end of March. It is a hammer blow to the local economy down there in Durban, unless it's sold to another buyer. It's also a potential threat to the country's fuel supply, although both Shell and BP have promised to keep us supplied with refined product brought in by sea. So why have the oil supermajors made this decision? They're not saying so directly, but it's clear that neither company is prepared to make what would be a very sizable investment in South Africa to upgrade the plant. They're on record, though, as saying they are looking at options and they would prefer to sell it. Which, of course, brings us back to President Ramaphosa and his call for inbound foreign investment to help restart the economy. Here are two of the biggest companies in the world looking at a market they've both been in for donkey's years, and they're saying, you know what, I think we'll take a pass on this one. In its own way, it is as stark a statement, Jeremy, as the IMF's warning. It really is.
But again, Chris, in fairness, we are seeing some action from the National Prosecuting Authority. I think the number was about 6 or 7 ex-senior executives from sugar producer Tongaat Hewlett.
And not before time. This is a case which took its first baby steps last week, with the first appearance in court of 6 former Tongaat Hewlett executives, including ex-CEO Peter Stauder, charged with fraud. Alongside them, a former Deloitte audit partner, Gavin Kruger. They're accused of swindling 3.5 billion rand, that's billion with a B, from the company by backdating the sale of some of its land assets, in which manner they were able to concoct some very hefty bonus payouts for themselves. The scam nearly took Tongaat Hewlett under, and the accused are also charged with racketeering and contravening the Companies Act and the Financial Markets Act. Each of the 7 have been granted 30,000 rand bail. The case has been postponed till early in April. Tongaat Hewlett itself has welcomed the criminal case, which is based on a forensic investigation it commissioned and undertaken by PwC. Also remember, it has instituted, that's Tongaat Hewlett, has instituted a civil case against these people to try and recover at least some of the assets. So, perhaps, Jeremy, there is something to be said for getting the private sector involved after all.
That's how we're going to have to leave it. Thank you very much, Chris Gibbons, our business analyst right here on Mansfield Today. Tomorrow we'll be talking where's his mouth gone suddenly? Matters legal with advocate Lance Brogden. Until then, cherry bye.